Thank you, Jim, for coming and joining us. I think I have you turned on, so go ahead.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Bull, and I was in the U.S. Air Force Reserve, as it shows up here, 1992 to 2000. I lived here in Broomfield 45 years ago. This December, when I moved here, I was 6 years old, and as information in the handout says, I was born in Havre, Montana, 1966, and my dad was a veterinarian. He had a veterinary clinic in Chinook, Montana, which is a small town east of Havre in northern Montana, and we moved to Fort Collins and in 68, and then to Missouri in 71, and then moved back here to Colorado in 72 and lived over in Thornton while Mom and Dad's house was being built here in Broomfield. And then of all the times to move in to a new house 2 days before Christmas in 72. And so I had attended kindergarten out in Missouri, and then I went first through 6th grade at Cole Elementary here in Broomfield, and then Broomfield Junior High, 7th through 9th grade, which the junior high no longer exists. And then I went 3 years of high school at Broomfield High and graduated in 84, and I went to Metro State College at Denver, which is now Metropolitan State University. And I graduated from there in 91, and then enlisted in the Air Force Reserve 9 April 1992 at Lowry Air Force Base, which is closed. It closed in September 94, but they had an Air Force Reserve recruiting office there in the headquarters building, and that's where I enlisted at. And then I left for basic in May of 92, and I was assigned to the 302nd Airlift Wing and already had a job assigned. And so I flew down from Colorado Springs, and I started basic training. It was at 19 May 1992, and they were kind of nice to us. The TIs, which is the training instructor, or TI for short for military training instructor, they're the Air Force version of the drill sergeant in the Army or the drill instructor in the Marines. And they wear the campaign or the Smokey Bear hat like the Marines and Army do, except in the Air Force it's blue, and the women TIs wear a Australian style hat that curves up on one side. But they didn't start on it until we got to the barracks. And I remember the TI came down and he said, "On behalf of the United States Air Force, I want to welcome you. Now pick up those bags." And then we had to run up to the barracks, and I remember we all had to take a shower. And apparently the TI didn't think I was moving fast enough, because he kicked a trash can in front of me as I was going by him. And I wasn't marching in steps, so he told me to go back to the behind of the formation. And I remember, of course, I got my head shaved, and right after that I went into clothing issue, and I had an Air Force Falcons t-shirt on, and the TI was going to play some mind games with me, so he called me over. And he asked me if I was a fan of the Air Force, and I said yes, and he told me, "Let's see if you're a fan after today." And I remember one of the lines he used to say is, you had a reporting statement, which was "Sir Airman," and your last name, reports as ordered. Well, we didn't always get that right, some of us, and the TI would say, "What's the first," if you didn't say it, he would say to you, "What's the first 6 words out of that filthy pail of yours?" Or, "Pin those frickin' paws to your side." You're supposed to put your hands on your thigh, and when you're at attention. So yeah, a lot of mind games. The TIs, I thought, were essentially the comedians of the Air Force. Those guys were funny, but if you were an airman there in basic training, you didn't want to laugh. This uniform I'm wearing, I managed to squeeze in. It was the one I wore when I was in the Air Force Reserve. This is the woodland camouflage battle dress uniform, which the Air Force no longer wears. It was phased out in 2011. But I can remember the TI telling me I looked like a duffel bag in my BDUs, so I got some fashion advice from him. And then if you had your collar up, popular thing for the TIs to say was, Elvis is dead, put your collar down. Or, Elvis, put your collar down. So in basic training, we learned how to march, customs and courtesies, how to wear the uniform, make the bed. I remember one airman didn't take his BDU cap off inside the barracks, and that was a big no-no. The TI caught him, and he made him stomp on his hat and say, "You're a bad hat." So I guess that got the message through, not to wear your hat inside. Another thing, instead of like in the Army and Marines where you had to do push-ups if you messed up, they had something called the Air Training Command Form 341, and you had to have at least 2 of those on your person at all times, or no more than, at least 2 and no more than 4, and it was called an excellency/discrepancy report, and I have a copy of one if anyone wants to see it. That essentially, if you did something wrong or actually did something good, the TI would say, "Give me out some paperwork, son." So you'd hand him one of those ATC Form 341s, and then he'd write down on it. And at that time, Air Force basic training was 6 weeks, and now I believe it's 8.5. And I ended up going a little longer because, lucky me, I got recycled. I hadn't been making my time in the 1.5 mile run, and once you know it, the day that they recycled me to another flight, I had actually made my time, but there was 5 other times where I didn't, so I got put back to another flight. I was 1 week from graduation, so I get put back with another flight. It was at day 17, and I didn't have any more problems after that making my time, and I graduated with that second flight in July '92. And then I went off to basic training, or not basic training, but Air Force Aircraft Electrical Environmental Technical School at Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois, which that base has since closed. I think it closed September '93. And so I was in the student squadron there, and I started out on the night shift, which I believe was 3 to midnight, and then I got sick later on, and I missed class, and they put me on the day shift, and that's which I believe it was 6 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, and I was on that for the rest of the time I was there, and I completed tech school in February '93, and then March '93 I did my first what they call a UTA, unit training assembly. That was the weekend training with Air Force Reserve with 302nd Airlift Wing. I was assigned to the 302nd Maintenance Squadron in the Electrical Environmental Shop, and I was with them till July '94. Then I transferred to 39th Aerial Port Squadron. While I was with the Electrical Environmental Shop, I worked mostly on electrical. I didn't really do much in the way of environmental, like with the oxygen tanks. I did work a little bit on the aircraft squibs. Those are the extinguisher bottles for the hold the fire extinguisher for the engines, and they're in the fuselage up under the wing. And I worked on air conditioning unit, and that's where I did my first annual tour, was at Peterson Air Force Base in August of '93. Then August '94, after I transferred to the 39th Aerial Port Squadron, I went to the U.S. Air Force Air Transportation Tech School at Lackland Air Force Base. That was a 6-week course. So I completed that in October, and so I had a level 3 in both career fields after completing tech school. And this badge you see on my aircrew name patch was my air transportation badge.
What aircraft?
It was C-130 primarily. Yeah. Yeah, when I was in electrical environmental, that was the only aircraft I worked on. On air transportation, I loaded cargo and offloaded cargo from aircraft, and then I did that with other aircraft besides C-130s, but primarily C-130. And that's a 4-engine turboprop aircraft, and on this display board you can see it. It's this one, right? Oops, it's this one right here, and it's actually been in service with the Air Force now for 60 years. And when I was there in '94, the 302nd started getting all new C-130H models directly from the Lockheed assembly plant in Georgia. I think they flew them directly up there, and that's what. I believe there's a picture. Yeah, this picture here, and I believe it's also. Like, don't mess this up. I can't seem to get this to. Having a problem here. It's not, but yeah, that's when in '94 when we got the new one, and you can see it on. I guess it's also on the handout too. Those are nice because they had flush toilets in them. The older C-130s didn't. They just had a can. Some of the things I did when I was a 39th Aerial Port Squadron, I did drive the forklift to haul cargo, a little bit. That they I don't think I ever drove the K-loader. That was a flatbed vehicle used to haul cargo. And the forklifts, they had to drive backwards because you had the mast in front of you with the cargo. So they drove them backwards, and the driver would have to look behind him when he's driving it out on the flight line. And I was kind of the chalk man a lot. I'd hold the chalk behind the aircraft, and that would keep the forklift or the K-loader from running into the back of the C-130, which that's something the Air Force didn't like, was to have their aircraft run into. Sadly, we did lose one C-30 crew when I was in May '95, and I don't know if anybody remembers this if you were around here. The Air Force Reserve, and it mentions it in the handout, does aerial firefighting, the MASS, Mobile Airborne, Modular Airborne Firefighting System. And I actually helped load that onto a C-130 one time. It's in 3 sections, but the air crews would go up to train in Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho for that MAFS training. And May '95, one of the 302nd C-130s was flying back to Peterson, and it got an engine fire. And the pilot put it into a dive to try and get the fire out, and the engine, the wing, it came off along with the engine. I think it had burnt through the wing or weakened it, and so they lost control and crashed. And I believe there was wreckage spread for 2 miles from the crash site. And I didn't know any of the aircrew members, but I did go to the memorial service at the Air Force Academy, and I went to the dedication of the there's a it's a statue, or not a statue, but a model of a C-130 in memory of the crew there at Peterson. I used to do 1 weekend a month as a traditional reservist, and then I did 2 weeks out of the year, and I'd go on annual tour, sometimes at my home base, sometimes at other bases. I did do one overseas annual tour in '95. I got to go to Osan Air Base, South Korea. That was kind of interesting. I got to take a tour of the demilitarized zone, and from what I'd heard, there'd never been any incidents in all the time they've been doing tours there. But we'd get off the bus, but we'd only get off for about 2 minutes at a time, and we had to get back on and then move along. And I have some pictures of that if anybody wants to see them. But on the base, they had no trash dumpsters because you get North Korean infiltrators. That was a great place for them to stash a bomb or something. So they just had a flat cement pad with a little bit of a brick wall built around it, and that's where they put the trash. And there was Patriot missile batteries around the base. I remember there was one by the restaurant at the country club, or the golf course. And then all the other IANDO tours I did were all in the U.S. It was at Charleston Air Force Base, South Carolina, Dover Air Force Base, Delaware, and Travis Air Force Base, California. And then I did some extra training up at Guernsey, Wyoming, at the Wyoming Army National Guard training site. And I had some of the Marine reservists work with us one time from Buckley. And the Air Force has its advantages, I guess, because all of us in the Air Force Reserve, we got to stay in town, the motel. The Marines had to bivouac. So a little bit of a short history of the U.S. Air Force. It was part of the Army originally. It was part of Aeronautical Division of U.S. Army Signal Corps when it was founded in 1907. 1914 it became the aviation section of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. And then during World War I, for 4 days, May 20 to 24, it was the Division of Military Aeronautics. And then it became the U.S. Army Air Service. And became U.S. Army Air Corps in 1926. And then in 1941, U.S. Army Air Forces were created, and the Air Corps became a subordinate unit to the Army Air Forces. And then 1947, the Air Force became a separate service. U.S. Air Force Reserve was founded in April 1948, and there was the Army had a reserve for the Air Force as well. And in 1917, the first Aero Reserve unit was formed in the Army. Now, originally, the Air Force Reserve, you couldn't directly enlist into it. And then in the 1950s, Congress changed the law where you could directly enlist. Before that, you had to have actually served active duty and then go on the reserve. Then they changed it where you could directly enlist. Of course, that's what I did. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Air Reserve Personnel Center, which they keep all the records of all Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve personnel. That was at Lowry Air Force Base until 2011, and it moved to Buckley. Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I'm assuming. I would guess I'd have to check, but they may have gotten just a totally brand new building, but I don't know. And I don't know where on the base it's at. Let's see. I'm going to go into the organization of the Air Force. In the 90s, when I was in, there was some changes. In the Air Force, you have Headquarters Air Force is the top echelon. And then you have the major commands, the numbered Air Force. And then there used to be air divisions, and those were phased out in the 90s. And those were primarily just operations and logistics. And the air division was completely phased out. And then you have the wing group, the squadron, and the flight. Flight being the lowest echelon of command. And usually each echelon above that was made up of two or more of the echelon below it. So a squadron is made up of two or more flights. A group is made up of two or more squadrons. A wing is made up of two or more groups. Some of you may be familiar with Military Airlift Command, Strategic Air Command, Tactical Air Command. They were all deactivated on 1 June 1992, and two new commands were activated. Air Combat Command, which that combined the functions of TAC and SAC, and then Air Mobility Command, which essentially took over what MAC did with airlift. And then just last year, 2016, MAC, SAC, and TAC were combined with ACC and AMC, and so they have those histories now. Because essentially what they did was deactivated those 3 commands and created 2 new ones, completely new. But last year the Air Force brought those 3 commands back. Essentially, well, the 2 commands. The SAC was brought back, I believe, in 2009 as Global Strike Command. Also, they came up with the concept of the composite wing, which had more than just one specific function like other wings did. They also dropped the strategic and tactical term from different wings. Also, and this was in 2000, you'll notice this Air Force logo here, or what was known as the origami, because it looks like somebody, did it with the thing with the paper, where you make different things. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. But you notice it looks similar to the World War II Hap Arnold Air Force emblem. I believe the 3 kind of wedge shapes stand for, I believe, the Reserve, Active Duty, and Civilian. And that came out in 2000. And Buckley Air Force Base here in Colorado was the first base in the Air Force to have that on their base sign. And also in 2000 was when Buckley, some of you may remember, it used to be Buckley Air National Guard Base. Well, on 1 October 2000, it became Buckley Air Force Base. And I went to the host change of command transfer ceremony, which was the next day. Some other changes that took place in the 90s regarding organizations: Air Force Logistics Command and Air Force Systems Command were merged to become Air Force Material Command 1 July 92. Air Training Command merged with Air University to become Air Education Training Command 1 July 93. And then regards to Air Force operations from 91 to 2001, Air Force was involved in 77 operations, and I have a listing of them up here, and I'm not going to go through every one of them. I also have one in my binder here if anybody wants to look at them, but I'll go over some of the major ones. Some of them you may remember. There's obviously Operation Desert Storm in 1991. That was before I went in. You're probably mostly familiar with that. Saddam Hussein, leader of Iraq, invaded Kuwait, and Allied forces led by the U.S. Liberated Kuwait, and that war started 17 January 91. The U.S. Air Force was involved with that, flew many sorties, flying in cargo, bombing missions. And then there was, let's see, Operation Provide Comfort from 91 to 96, which turned into Northern Watch from 97 to 2003. That was over in Iraq. That was providing food for, I believe, the Kurds, and then it became into preventing the Iraqi Air Force from flying up over a certain area to attack the Kurds. There was Operation Provide Relief and Restore Hope 1, which was in Somalia in Africa, flying in supplies. Operation Provide Promise from 92 to 96. I believe that was in Bosnia. Operation Noble Eagle 2001, which was right after 9/11 terrorist attacks. That was Air Patrols was part of it. here in the U.S. And then Operation Enduring Freedom, which was response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That started 7 October of '01 with B-1 and B-52 bombing raids over Afghanistan. Now, I'll go into the Air Force aircraft, equipment, vehicles, and weapons, some of them. Now, if you look at this display board, you can see some of the Air Force aircraft that were in use from 91 to '01, and some of them have been phased out. And I believe the B-2 bomber was actually phased in at that time, but the F-4 Phantom fighter, I believe the F-111 were phased out in the 90s. The F-111 has been phased out. The HH-53 helicopter, I believe, was phased out about 2008. And see the RQ-1 Predator unmanned aerial vehicle, or the drone, that went into service, I believe, in 1994.
Well, Jim, could you comment on some of the aircraft that you were involved in down
Yeah, well, primarily C-130. When I was on an annual tour, I got to upload cargo on C-141, and I've been on the C-17, which was the Air Force's newest cargo aircraft. That was introduced in the 90s. And then there was the C-5, which was the largest of the cargo aircraft the Air Force has. And when I was on annual tour at Travis Air Force Base, California, in 1998, one of them did a training mission, and they had to have some type of weight on the aircraft. They couldn't fly it empty, so they put 5 all-terrain forklifts on it, and I helped secure those.
I was wondering, when we look at some of the missions the reserves do, I didn't realize part of it is also aerial firefighting and
Yeah.
disaster humanitarian assistance,
Yeah.
disaster relief. Did your unit get involved?
They did the maps, but for the time I was in, we were never involuntary activated. It was all, if you volunteer, you could volunteer. There was one fella in my unit, he volunteered to go over to the Middle East for a time. And there was the Bosnia going on, and then they had other things you could volunteer for. I remember some people in my unit went over to Thailand. I remember the annual tour to Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. The sign-up list for that filled up real quick. I never got to go there or to Alaska, but now one of the pieces of equipment used in air transportation was what's known as the 463L pallet, and that was a standardized pallet with a locking mechanism in the aircraft that the Air Force started using in April of '63, hence the 463 on the designation. And that had a balsa wood interior with an aluminum skin, and I believe it was about 108 inches by 88 inches, and they used that to put cargo on. And then there would be 3 cargo nets, which weren't always used depending on how much cargo, but there would always be 3 cargo nets with the cargo that was on the pallet. And then they put plastic over the cargo and then the netting, and the netting would hook onto there were rings on the pallet, and then either by a forklift or a K-loader, it'd be loaded onto the aircraft. And it was a standardized locking system on the different cargo aircraft the Air Force has, and once it was in the track on the aircraft, then it could be locked in place. And the C-130 could hold 6 of those 463L pallets, but the configuration had to be so anybody on the aircraft could get to the back to use the toilet. So they had to leave, I believe, like an 18 inches of clearance so you could get to the back along the side to get to the toilet. And it was the C-130, the rear cargo door, it was limited height. You know, the rest of the aircraft, I think you could go up to 76 inches, but on the cargo door, you know, it had to be less than that because it was in at an angle, and you didn't want the cargo to hit the ceiling of the aircraft. Now, some of the different no, that's actually what I wanted to do when I first went in, and I actually interviewed for it later on with the Airlift Squadron there under the 302nd, and but yeah, I never got on that, and that would have been a separate thing to train at. I believe the training for that is at Little Rock Air Force Base in Arkansas, and you know, because I get motion sickness, I don't know if I could have done it anyways. But yeah, that's what I originally wanted to do. And the Loadmaster is a Air Force career field that's enlisted, and they are part of the air crew, and they work with the cargo on the aircraft. Now, some of the, because I worked out on the flight line, I got issued it was steel toe boots. So if something fell on your foot, you know, it wouldn't totally crush your toes. I don't know if they still use steel toe now or if it's more like a fiberglass. I'd have to look into that. But when I was in, we wore steel toe boots. And then working in air transportation, I was issued leather gloves and what they called Mickey Mouse ears. You see me, that's what I'm wearing here in this photo. This was my first flight on a C-130 up to Guernsey, Wyoming in June of '95. These blue hearing protection, that was the Mickey Mouse ears. And the C-130 had no you know, it had no sound insulation, so you had to wear hearing protection in it. And we did something called sometimes an engine offload or engine running offload or onload, where the engines would be running and we would load cargo or offload cargo. Well, when we did that, that's when we had to wear these along with the earplugs, and no radio contact. We all had to work like, you know, with hand signals. Didn't do that very often, but that made things kind of interesting doing it like that. Another thing I was issued was a reflective belt, so you know, you could be seen out on the flight line at night. And I had some field gear, and some of the same type of field gear that I was issued, they have here at the museum. And then, of course, I got issued the duffel bag, which I think most everybody got issued. And we used to have something called a bag drag, where your duffel bag or another type of bag, you had to keep you know, your BDUs. I had to have a 30-day supply of razors and other items, and you'd bring that in every so often, and they'd we also with the 302nd Airlift Wing, we had each member of the wing had what they called three mobility bags, which are kept in a warehouse, and those one of them had like chem warfare suits, and the other had cold weather gear, and
So was that so you could deploy at
yeah.
72-hour notice?
Yeah, well, whatever hour notice it was, but yeah. And occasionally I worked in there updating equipment in the bags. I got to even put stuff in my own bags, which was kind of convenient. But
Well, could you maybe comment for us as to your service in reserves and the Air Force training? How did that help you grow as a person? I mean, what did you learn from all that?
oh,
Would you recommend it to other young people?
I guess it made me possibly somewhat more disciplined. You know, I had.
What made you join?
Well, I was interested in the military and patriotism and interest in aviation. And I was one of the older people in basic training. Most of the guys in there were probably 18, 19. There was one guy who was actually older than me, and he was in his 30s. And the second flight I was in basic, I was actually the only reservist. Everybody else was active duty. Regarding more of the equipment, we did have to train sometimes in the chemical warfare gear or the MOPS gear, mission orientation protective posture, and there were different MOPS levels where you would be wearing only some of the gear, and then there was level 4 where you'd be wearing all of it with the gas mask. And I did that once and had it all on for about an hour, and drank some water out of the canteen through the drinking tube. But that's not something that'd be real pleasant if you had to do it for a prolonged period. You can ask some of the guys who were in Desert Storm about that, being in the chem warfare suit in that hot weather.
But with Europe, we had to train and do that as well.
Yeah. Did you have to be in it in prolonged periods?
We did it for
Yeah.
a couple of times.
I was fortunate. I was only in it for an hour, inside. Another thing we did was go into the gas chamber. That wasn't real pleasant because I didn't get a good seal on my mask, and so I inhaled some of that tear gas, and that was nasty. Not something I recommend.
But you want to kind of finish up then?
Yeah, I was just going to finish up on the equipment and then go into uniforms. Another vehicle I drove was the M1008 pickup, and you see that photo here, the security forces member. Except the one I drove was woodland camouflage. And then the M16 was the only weapon I ever fired. I only did live fire twice in basic, and then one time out at the Air Force Academy. And then the Air Force also had something called, it was a computerized system where you fire the M16 at a computer screen, and there was 4 of them. And I did that, I think, once at Peterson. It was called FATS. It was the acronym Firearm Training System. And then another thing I did was we fired laser beams at each other. I went twice out to Air Base Ground Perimeter Defense training at Fort Carson with the Air Force Security Forces. And the MILES gear that's an acronym for Military Infrared Laser Emitter System. And it's a laser emitter that they put on near the end of the rifle, and you use blanks in the M16, and when you fire around it, blast of air from the end of the rifle registers on that on a sensor, and it emits a laser beam, and then everyone wears sensors, and then beam hits those sensors and it starts beeping, and then somebody comes around with what they call the God gun and resurrects you, and you don't beep anymore.
Well, how about the uniforms then?
Yeah, I'll go into that. There was the changes in the Air Force uniforms in the 90s. I'll start off with the utility uniforms. I started collecting Air Force uniforms in 1997, and I do displays at different events for different periods of the Air Force. I go from World War II up to the present. Now, I never wore this one. This is the olive green shade 507 utility uniform shirt. This was phased out by the Air Force in September '91. I never wore this. This is just part of my collection. And then these are ones I actually did wear when I was in the Air Force. This is one I was actually issued in basic training. This one here with the name, it has the name tapes. And then you might notice this one I'm wearing. This is one I've actually had when I was in the Air Force. I managed to squeeze into it. From 1992 to 97, the Air Force used the aircrew name patch on the BDUs, this was the patch like what they used on the flight coveralls. And I think probably the reasoning for using this was to make the Air Force BDUs look more distinctive from the other branches, because they all were using cloth tapes with the name of the branch and then the member's last name. And I think this was probably an attempt to make the Air Force's BDUs look more distinctive. So, you know, if you see this aircrew patch, then you know that's somebody in the Air Force. Then they had used it before 92 on the 6-color Desert BDUs in Desert Storm. This one has the aircrew patch on it, and what they did initially, and you'll notice it on this one, there was no insignia, either enlisted or officers, on the shirt when they first started using the aircrew patches on BDUs in 92. Well, then in April 93, they started allowing the insignia on them again. I think that didn't go over real well with the personnel in the Air Force not being able to wear their grade insignia. And then 97, the Air Force decided to go back to wearing the cloth tapes. And so, then they also, and you noticed, I couldn't seem to get, I don't know if I was pushing the wrong button here.
Push the arrow button on the right side.
Okay.
Yeah,
Other screen.
Oh,
We'll
which,
just, go back to here. Okay, so, okay, there's the dress, they're the only.
okay, here we go. Yeah, here, and you'll notice it on here. But here's the new, old and the new Air Force grade insignia. I wore both of them. The newer one was phased in 1994, and you notice E4, senior airmen and below, have the star. Although it was there anyways, it was what they called subdued, and the star was the same color as the color of the circle it was in. But then when they came out with a new insignia, then they changed it on these ones to blue, and then on the to white on this one. That was a way, when they used the subdued ones, it was a way to differentiate between the NCOs and the lower grade airmen. But then they did away with the E4 sergeant starting in 91. That grade was completely phased out in 97. So I went and got the new grade insignia fairly soon after they came out, and I used to get mistaken for an E4 sergeant. I used to get called sergeant once in a while, even though I was a senior airman. And then eventually the older style grade insignia, I think were completely phased out in 1999. And you notice with the senior NCOs starting at E7, Master Sergeant, with the new insignia, they all had at least one stripe up. You notice on the older one, you know, only the upper two do. But that was meant as a way to distinguish, you know, the senior NCOs. You know, you see that one stripe up, then you knew, you know, that was a senior NCO. And then also, General McPeak, he was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force from 91 to 95, and he came up with an unpopular idea. You can see it here. It was to have the Air Force officers wearing their grade on the sleeves like the U.S. Navy or a airline pilot. Well, that didn't go over well, and then General Fogelman, who replaced him as Air Force Chief of Staff in 95, one of the first things he did was to go back to wearing the officer's grade insignia on the shoulder epaulet of on the service coat. So this didn't last very long, having the grade on the sleeves, and the officers who had already gotten that could get retrofit, which they could take, you know, taking them in and get the epaulets sewn on the service coat, and then wear the grade insignia on that. So that was short-lived with the officer grade on the sleeves. And then they came out with a new service uniform in 94, and I have that's a small picture of it here, but it was, General McPeak wanted more of a business type suit that was uncluttered, and initially it didn't have the U.S. insignia on it, and that was added back in, and I think I have let me, we don't mess this up again.
What's,
Yeah.
what's the top enlisted insignia of the Air Force now? Is that a D9?
Yeah, it would be, well, an E9, you have the Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force.
One guy, right?
Yeah, he's the top enlisted of the Air Force. And they don't show it here, but, well, I think he has laurel leaves around the star. And there's also, there was the new insignia for Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force. They also added something into that diamond area above the star. And I'd have to look at it. They also have a 5-pointed star for Command's Chief Sergeant, Master Sergeant now too, which is something else they added. But you can see here me on the left there, I'm in the Air Force service uniform with my birth control glasses, which I won't go in about that, but just to say they were real ugly Air Force issue glasses, and I hated wearing them. I actually have them here if anybody wants to see them. And there I am wearing what's called the McConnell Air Force service coat, and that was named after General McConnell, who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force in the late 60s, and he, I think, came up with this style of service coat, which was in use up until '99 when it was phased out. And also I don't have any women's uniforms here, but some of the changes in those in the 90s, the women used to wear a rounded collar light blue blouse, and they did change to a pointed collar in the 90s. And also the women's blue slacks used to not have belt loops, and then they started allowing the women to wear a belt, so they started putting belt loops on them. They also used to allow us to wear up to 3 different colors of colored undershirts with BDUs. We used to allow green, brown, and black, then they phased out green. I think maybe they didn't want to have so many different colors made. Let's see.
So that kind of summarizes.
And then the Air Force switched over to this 3-color Desert BDU in '93, and you can see this is one of my light blue shirts. This has the older style subdued star insignia, and then this is my service coat, the same one that was in that photo with the newer stripes on it and some of my ribbons. And the U.S. insignia, it used to be the enlisted wore ones with the round circle, and then they changed it to where they could wear the officer style, and then they changed it back to the ones with the circles. And I guess I'll finish it there. If anybody wants
Anyone
to
have other questions?
yeah.
I was in the
Hi.
Air Force from 65 to 69, and at the time it was SAC, TAC, and ABC. What became of the Air Defense Command?
You know what? It sounds familiar, but I'd have to look that up. I don't know if they were completely deactivated or merged with another command.
Merge.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
So when you were in boot camp and they gave you that, they asked for that paper and they signed it, did they give that back to you? Or did
I'm trying to remember. I seem to remember getting mine back one time with the TI's writing on it, but
so it could be added to as you went along?
yeah, you didn't want to pile up too many of the bad ones. Fortunately, I didn't have. I think I had one pulled one time when I had my cap on inside, but and then even in tech school when I was what they called non-prior service when I came right out of tech school, or I mean right out of basic to go to tech school. And then you had to put them like on your bed after you made your bed, so when they did a room inspection, you know, if there was something wrong.
So it was like demerits?
Yeah. I remember in tech school, I had to put on extra duty, my roommate and I both, because he somehow had a safety violation. You had to keep the iron on the floor, on the tile floor, faced out from the wall. Well, when they did the room inspection, guess what? irons facing the wall, that's a safety violation, automatic failure. I have no idea it happened because it was facing out when I left, so.
Well, anyway, well, Jim, I'd like to thank you very
Yeah.
much for joining us
Yeah.
and sharing your time.
Yeah.
And here's one of our
Oh.
challenge coins
Oh, thanks.
as a reminder. And I hope you'll stick around, talk with Jim some more. Also, we have a very special guest. I noticed Uwe Grafengetter is in our library. You can't see him right here, but Uwe served in World War II with the 3rd Army, Patton's Army. Marvelous gentleman, was a previous CNC speaker as well, and has a marvelous story. In fact, in one of our books there, you'll have his handout from when he taught. But again, thank you very much for joining us. We have plenty of donuts, coffee still, and please come up and look at some of the uniforms here with Jim, and we'll gladly share some more. And also then check out our little tablet here and play some of the little videos. So thank you very much again.